In 430 BC, Athens wasn't just facing a plague, it was watching its entire civilization crumble from the inside out. This is the story of how the greatest city in the ancient world lost its mind, and how a disease turned neighbors into strangers, honor into a joke, and a golden age into a nightmare that would be remembered for thousands of years. Picture this. It's the summer of 430 BC, and Athens is at the absolute peak of its power. The Parthenon, that massive temple you've probably seen in history books, was just finished a few years ago. Pericles, one of the greatest leaders in human history, is running things. Athens has beaten back the Persian Empire, controls most of the Aegean Sea, and is basically the superpower of the Mediterranean. Art, philosophy, democracy, all of it is flourishing here. This is what historians call the Golden Age of Athens. Now here's the twist. In just a few months, all of that is about to collapse, and it won't be because of war or invasion. It'll be because of something invisible, something they couldn't fight with swords or strategy, something that would turn the birthplace of democracy into absolute chaos. Let's rewind just a bit to understand why this plague hit Athens so hard. A year before the plague shows up, in 431 BC, Athens goes to war with Sparta. This is the famous Peloponnesian War, and it's basically ancient Greece's version of World War I, two massive alliances fighting for control of the entire Greek world. Now, Athens and Sparta had completely different strengths. Sparta had the best land army anyone had ever seen. Their soldiers were trained from childhood to be killing machines. Athens knew they couldn't beat Sparta in an open field battle, so Pericles came up with this clever strategy. Pull everyone inside the city walls, let the Spartans trash the countryside, and just wait them out. Athens had something Sparta didn't, a massive navy and control of the sea. They could bring in food and supplies by ship, while the Spartans were stuck outside the walls getting frustrated.
On paper, this plan was brilliant. In reality, it created the perfect storm. Athens had these massive walls, called the Long Walls, that connected the city to its port at Piraeus. Safe from invasion, right? But here's what nobody thought about. Athens normally had a population of around 250,000 to 300,000 people. Now suddenly, everyone from the countryside is flooding into the city. Farmers, their families, their animals, everyone's packed inside these walls. The population inside the walls probably shot up to over 400,000 people, crammed into a space that wasn't designed for that many. People were living in makeshift shelters, cramped conditions, no proper sanitation. The streets were packed, the air was thick, and it was the beginning of summer, which meant it was getting hot. This is where our story really begins. In early May of 430 BC, ships started arriving at Piraeus, the port of Athens. These ships had been traveling through Egypt and Libya, stopping at various ports along the way, and they brought something with them, something deadly. At first, nobody really noticed. A few people in Piraeus got sick, then a few more. The symptoms were weird. People would suddenly develop intense headaches, and their eyes would turn bright red. Their throats would get inflamed, and they'd start coughing. But that was just the beginning. Here's where it gets really dark. The disease would start in your head. Violent, burning fevers that made people feel like they were on fire from the inside. Thucydides, the historian who survived this plague and wrote it all down, said people couldn't stand to wear even the lightest clothing. They felt so hot that they'd rip off all their clothes and throw themselves into cold water, trying to cool down. Some people were so desperate, they jumped into water tanks and just stayed there. Others were drinking massive amounts of water, but their thirst was never satisfied. They'd throw up everything they drank. The fever would rage for days.
Then, if you survived that first week, which most people didn't, the disease would move to your bowels. Severe diarrhea that would leave you completely dehydrated. Your skin would break out in these red pustules and sores all over your body. Some people developed gangrene in their fingers and toes, which would just rot off. Others went completely blind. And here's one of the most haunting details. Some people who survived would wake up with total memory loss. They couldn't remember their own names. They didn't recognize their families. They had become complete strangers to everyone, including themselves. The death rate was insane. If you got this disease, your chances of dying were somewhere around 20 to 25%. But in those crowded conditions of wartime Athens, it felt like everyone was dying. The plague killed somewhere between 75,000 and 100,000 people. That's about a quarter of the entire population gone in just 3 years. To put that in perspective, imagine if a disease hit New York City today and killed 2 million people in 3 years. That's the scale we're talking about. Now here's where things get even more disturbing: the social breakdown. Because it's not just about people dying, it's about what happened to the survivors. Athens had always prided itself on being civilized. They invented democracy. They had elaborate funeral rites. They believed in honor, justice, respect for the gods. All of that started falling apart within weeks. Thucydides describes it in this chilling way. He says the catastrophe was so overwhelming that people became completely indifferent to every rule of religion or law. Think about what that means. The Athenians believed the gods were watching everything they did. They believed in an afterlife. They believed that how you lived and how you died mattered. But when people are watching their entire families die in a matter of days, when they think they're next, all of that stops mattering.
Let me paint you a picture of what the streets looked like. Funeral rites in ancient Athens were a huge deal. When someone died, the family would prepare the body, hold a procession, and cremate or bury them with specific rituals. It was about honoring the dead and ensuring their soul could pass into the afterlife properly. But when the plague hit, there were too many bodies, way too many. The system completely broke down. Families couldn't keep up. Professional undertakers were dying faster than anyone because they were exposed to the sick constantly. So people started getting creative. And by creative, I mean absolutely horrific. Thucydides tells us that people would carry their dead relatives to a funeral pyre that someone else had prepared, throw the body on top, and just walk away. Sometimes they'd see a pyre that was already burning with someone else's body on it, toss their own dead on top, and leave. Mass graves were being dug everywhere. Bodies were just piled up on the streets because nobody could keep up with the death toll. The smell must have been unbelievable. And remember, the Greeks believed that not getting a proper burial meant your soul would wander forever. These people were condemning their own family members to an eternity of suffering, and they just didn't care anymore because they figured they'd be dead soon anyway. But it gets worse, way worse. Because it wasn't just the funeral rites that collapsed, it was morality itself. Thucydides describes this shift in the most chilling terms. He says people resolved to spend their money quickly and spend it on pleasure, because both money and life seemed equally temporary. Nobody expected to live long enough to enjoy a good reputation, so why bother acting honorably? Fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. Let that sink in. Athens, the birthplace of Western philosophy and democracy, descended into absolute hedonism and lawlessness in a matter of months. Rich people who seemed perfectly healthy would suddenly die, and poor people who had nothing would inherit their wealth overnight. So people stopped planning for the future. They stopped caring about consequences. They started doing whatever they wanted because tomorrow they might be dead.
Crime skyrocketed. People started stealing openly. Why not? You might be dead next week. Traditional honor? Forget it. The idea that you should live virtuously and build a good reputation? Nobody cared. Thucydides says perseverance in what men called honor was popular with none because it was so uncertain whether they would be spared to attain the object. What's the point of being a good person if you're going to die before anyone remembers you for it? This is the psychology of a society in collapse. And the most tragic part? The people who tried to help were the ones who died first. Doctors and healers rushed to help the sick. They died in droves. Family members who took care of their loved ones, they caught the disease and died too. So people stopped helping each other. Thucydides describes how the sick would often die completely alone because nobody was willing to risk exposure. Can you imagine? Lying there, burning with fever, covered in sores, unable to remember your own name, and everyone you know has abandoned you because they're terrified of catching what you have?
The few people who did help were the survivors. People like Thucydides, who had already had the disease and recovered, seemed to develop immunity. They couldn't catch it again, so they became the primary caretakers, the only ones willing to go near the dying. Some of them did it out of compassion. Others did it because they'd lost everything and figured they might as well help. There was even a legend that Hippocrates himself, the father of medicine, who was about 30 years old at the time, rushed to Athens to help fight the plague, but even his legendary skills couldn't stop it. The plague didn't care who you were, rich or poor, young or old, citizen or slave, it killed indiscriminately. And this freaked people out, because in ancient times, people thought diseases were punishments from the gods. If you got sick, it was because you'd done something wrong. But this plague was different. Good people, pious people, people who'd done everything right, they were dying just as fast as criminals, maybe faster, because the good people were the ones trying to help. So people started losing faith in the gods. What's the point of praying if the gods aren't listening? What's the point of making sacrifices at temples if everyone dies anyway? Thucydides mentions that prayers and visits to temples did nothing to help. In fact, people eventually stopped going altogether. The temples sat empty. The priests didn't know what to do. Some people thought the Spartans had poisoned the water supply. That made sense at first, especially since the disease seemed to start in Piraeus, where the water came in. But then it spread everywhere, even to places Spartans couldn't reach. So that theory fell apart.
Others remembered an old prophecy that had been passed down for generations. It talked about a Dorian war, meaning a war with Sparta, and it mentioned either limos, which means famine, or loimos, which means plague. People had debated for years which word was correct. Now, with bodies piling up in the streets, everyone suddenly agreed it must have said plague. Funny how people make prophecies fit their current situation. But here's the thing. While the Athenians were trying to figure out what was happening, the plague was doing exactly what plagues do. It was spreading fast. The disease moved through the crowded streets like wildfire. One person would get sick, they'd infect their whole household, those people would infect their neighbors, and on and on. The port workers got it first, since the disease came in by ship. Then it moved into the upper city, where the population was most dense. The long walls that were supposed to protect Athens had turned it into a death trap. The worst part about this plague was that it was a virgin soil epidemic. That's a term epidemiologists use for when a disease hits a population that's never been exposed to it before. No immunity, no resistance, no idea how to treat it. Everyone was equally vulnerable. And in those cramped, unsanitary conditions with summer heat beating down, it just exploded through the population. Thucydides noted that even the animals that would normally eat human corpses wouldn't touch the bodies of plague victims. Birds and dogs that would usually scavenge stayed away. Either they'd tried and died from it, or they could somehow sense the danger. Either way, it meant that bodies rotted in the streets even longer because nothing would touch them. Now let's talk about the casualties, because they weren't just random people. They were some of the most important figures in Athens. Pericles, the guy who'd been running Athens for 15 years and basically turned it into a superpower, his 2 sons died of the plague, both of them gone. Can you imagine? You're the most powerful man in Greece. You have all the money and resources in the world, and you watch both your sons die, and you can't do anything about it. Then Pericles himself caught it. He'd survived the worst of the disease, but he was weakened. In 429 BC, about a year after the plague started, Pericles died. His last words were reportedly something like this: "This is the one thing I didn't foresee." The greatest mind in Athens, the man who planned for everything, never saw this coming. When Pericles died, Athens lost more than just a leader. They lost their direction. The people who came after him weren't anywhere near as capable. Some were corrupt, others were incompetent, and a few were straight-up demagogues who just told people what they wanted to hear. The quality of leadership in Athens never really recovered. And it wasn't just Pericles. Remember I mentioned those death tolls? The plague killed 4,400 hoplites. Those were citizen soldiers, the backbone in Athens' military. It killed 300 cavalry, which were usually rich guys with horses, the elite. and an unknown number of regular citizens, probably tens of thousands more. But here's what really hurt. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed knowledge. Skilled workers, master craftsmen, experienced sailors who knew how to navigate, doctors who had years of practice, all gone. You can't replace that overnight. The Athenian navy, which was supposed to be their trump card in this war, was crippled because so many experienced sailors died. Even the Spartans were terrified. They'd been camping outside Athens, ready to invade and burn the countryside, but when they saw the smoke from all the funeral pyres in Athens, they packed up and left. They didn't want anything to do with whatever was happening in there. For once, the fearless Spartan warriors said, "Nope, we're out." That's how scary this plague was. So Athens survived that first wave in 430 BC. The plague died down a bit as winter came. Maybe people thought the worst was over. Maybe they thought the gods had finally shown mercy. They were wrong. The plague came back in the summer of 429 BC, and then again in the winter of 427 to 426 BC. Each time, more people died. Each time, society broke down a little more. By the time it was finally over, Athens was a shell of what it had been. Over a third of the population was dead. The economic system had collapsed because so many workers and merchants were gone. Wealth had been redistributed in the weirdest ways, where some poor people suddenly became rich just by inheriting from dead relatives. The psychological damage was even worse. Athenians had prided themselves on their civilization, their culture, their democracy. They thought they were better than everyone else. Then this plague came and showed them they were just as vulnerable as anyone, maybe more vulnerable because they were so crowded together. The old values of honor and duty and respect for the gods, those took 15 years to come back, if they ever really did. Thucydides wrote later that Athens never really recovered from the plague, not fully. Estimates suggest it took 15 years just for the population to get back to pre-plague numbers, but the damage to Athenian society was permanent. The war with Sparta dragged on for another 24 years after the plague ended. Athens tried to recover. They launched a few successful campaigns, but they were never as strong as they'd been before. In 415 BC, Athens finally felt confident enough to try something big. They launched the Sicilian expedition, a massive military campaign to conquer Sicily. It was supposed to be their comeback. It was a total disaster. The entire Athenian fleet was destroyed. Thousands of soldiers died or were captured and sold into slavery. It was one of the worst military defeats in ancient history. And historians pretty much agree that Athens never fully recovered from the plague. If they'd had their full strength, if they'd had all those soldiers and sailors who died in 430 BC, the Sicilian expedition might have succeeded. The war might have gone differently, but they didn't. The plague had taken too much from them. In 404 BC, Athens finally surrendered to Sparta. The Golden Age was over. The democracy was briefly dissolved, the walls were torn down, the navy was dismantled. Athens became just another Greek city-state, no longer the superpower it had been. And you can trace it all back to that summer in 430 BC when the plague arrived. Now, here's the question that historians and scientists have been arguing about for literally thousands of years. What was this plague? What disease caused all of this? And honestly, we still don't know for sure. Thucydides gave us an incredibly detailed description of the symptoms, more detailed than almost any ancient account of disease. He did this on purpose. He wanted future generations to be able to recognize the disease if it ever came back. But despite all that detail, we can't pin it down. Over the years, people have suggested about 30 different diseases. Typhus is probably the most popular theory. A 1999 conference at the University of Maryland concluded it was probably typhus, and a lot of historians agree. Typhus hits hard during war and famine, kills about 20 to 25% of infected people, causes fever and rashes, and can lead to gangrene of the fingers and toes. All of that matches Thucydides' description pretty well. Plus, typhus spreads through body lice, and those crowded, unsanitary conditions in Athens would have been perfect for lice. But others say it was smallpox. Smallpox causes high fever, pustules all over the body, blindness in survivors, and gangrene.
That matches too. Then there's typhoid fever. In 2006, scientists tested dental pulp from teeth recovered from a mass grave in Athens that dated to the plague years. They found DNA sequences similar to Salmonella enterica, the bacteria that causes typhoid. Case closed, right? Not so fast. Other scientists criticized that study. They said the methodology was flawed, that the samples could have been contaminated, that typhoid doesn't cause gangrene or explain a lot of the symptoms Thucydides described. Some people have even suggested more exotic diseases, Ebola or a similar hemorrhagic fever, measles, which can be deadly in populations that have never been exposed to it, toxic shock syndrome, a combination of multiple diseases hitting at once, or, and this is the scariest possibility, maybe it was a disease that doesn't exist anymore. Maybe it was something that killed so many people so fast that it burned itself out and went extinct. Or maybe the bacteria or virus evolved so much over 2,500 years that we wouldn't recognize it today even if we saw it. That's the thing about ancient diseases. They change over time just like we do. A disease that was incredibly deadly in 430 BC might be relatively mild today because both the pathogen and human immune systems have adapted. Or it might not exist at all anymore. We'll probably never know for sure what the plague of Athens was, and in a way, that makes it even more unsettling. Because if it came back today, would we recognize it? Would we be able to stop it? What we do know is what it did to Athens. It killed a quarter of the population. It destroyed the social order. It shattered people's faith in the gods, in their government, in each other. It turned one of the most advanced civilizations in the ancient world into a nightmare of bodies, crime, and despair. And it changed the course of Western history. If Athens had won the Peloponnesian War, if they'd remained the dominant power in Greece, the entire trajectory of ancient history could have been different. Alexander the Great might never have conquered the known world because his father, Philip of Macedon, rose to power in the vacuum left by Athens' decline. Rome might not have become the empire it did. The whole shape of Western civilization could have been different. All because of a disease that arrived on ships in the summer of 430 BC. All because a brilliant military strategy to avoid Spartan soldiers accidentally created the perfect conditions for an epidemic. All because sometimes history doesn't turn on great battles or brilliant leaders. Sometimes it turns on something you can't see. Something you can't fight, something that kills indiscriminately and leaves nothing but chaos in its wake. The plague of Athens is a reminder that civilizations, no matter how advanced or powerful, are fragile. It took decades to build Athens into the crown jewel of the ancient world. It took less than 3 years for a plague to destroy it. And the scariest part? We're not any safer today. We have better medicine, sure. We understand how diseases spread. We have antibiotics and vaccines. But we also have cities far more crowded than Athens ever was. We have global travel that can spread a disease around the world in days. We have the same human nature that led the Athenians to panic, to abandon their values, to descend into lawlessness when they thought death was certain. COVID-19 gave us a tiny taste of what the Athenians experienced. A disease nobody fully understood at first, overwhelming healthcare systems, people dying alone, society shutting down, trust in institutions eroding. And COVID had a death rate of maybe 1 to 2%. The plague of Athens killed 25%. Imagine if COVID had been 5 times deadlier. Imagine if a quarter of everyone you knew died in a year. Would our civilization have held together any better than Athens? Would we have kept our values, our sense of community, our faith in each other? Or would we have descended into the same chaos, the same lawlessness, the same desperate hedonism that consumed Athens? We like to think we're more advanced than the ancient Greeks, and in many ways we are. But when it comes to how we respond to existential threats, to things that make us face our own mortality, we're not that different. The plague of Athens is a mirror, and what we see in that mirror is terrifying because it shows us that civilization is thinner than we think, that the things we take for granted, rule of law, social order, basic human decency, all of that can vanish in a matter of weeks when people are scared enough. That's the real lesson of the Plague of Athens, not what the disease was, but what it revealed about human nature, about how quickly we can go from honor and dignity to survival at any cost, about how fast a golden age can turn into a dark age, about how fragile everything really is, and about how even 2,500 years later, we're still vulnerable to the same forces that brought Athens to its knees. So next time you hear about a new disease outbreak somewhere, next time there's a pandemic scare, remember Athens. Remember what happened when a great civilization thought it was invincible and then discovered it wasn't. Remember that history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. And hope that if something like the Plague of Athens ever comes again, we handle it better than they did. Check out the next video to see what happened to Athens after the plague ended and how they tried to rebuild their shattered empire.